What's the most ridiculous rule you've had to follow at a job? Story 1. At one of my earlier jobs, I had to follow a lunch bell like I was in school, except I worked in the lab and sometimes the testing I had to do made me miss the lunch bell and so I would eat later. People reported me, so I ended up delaying testing to meet the lunch. Production went down a lot, but at least I followed the lunch bell. Story 2. I was once told I wasn't allowed to drink out of a water bottle while working without a doctor's note saying that I needed to. I was a minimum wage cashier at a grocery store. Was a pretty funny doctor's appointment that followed. Story 3. People who discover a spill have to stand next to the spot until maintenance comes back with a broom mop. As the only one working maintenance, I got bitched at in this order. There's a spill. You need to go get the mop. Why did you go get the mop? You're supposed to stand next to it. When I said maybe you should hire a second maintenance person then, the look on her face every time I said this was priceless. Story 4. I got in trouble for having my 16-year-old daughter walk behind me while having a Zoom meeting, by my manager who had her 7-year-old walk in, ask a question of said manager, at which time she stopped the meeting to answer her daughter's question. I was actually written up for mine. I quit on the spot after being written up and went on a tirade against the manager. No regrets. Story 5. I worked in an upscale flower shop during college and we weren't allowed to sit, even when the store was empty, which it was for the majority of the day, since most people called in, so all the chairs were essentially decorative because we had to look busy for the customer that wasn't there, I guess. Story 6. At one job, we had a rule where no one could adjust their own office chairs. If you needed it higher, lower, or tilted differently, you had to submit a maintenance request. This wasn't just annoying during busy periods, it could take days for someone to come adjust your chair. It felt absurd sitting uncomfortably while waiting for authorized personnel to make a simple adjustment. Story 7. I still think requiring a doctor's note for an excused absence is stupid. I'm not going to waste money on a doctor's appointment if I have a cold or the flu. Story 8. If someone was banging on the door before opening time, we had to let them in. How about knowing getting my computer up and running, making sure the waiting room is tidy, getting my coffee and taking that door isn't opening until our office hours begin. Story 9. A friend just told me they would have cake in the break room for birthdays, but the time spent celebrating awkwardly standing around with a slice of cake would have to be made up at the end of the day. Story 10. I worked at a skating rink when I was 14 to 18. Typical day shifts were from 12 to 7 when the place was open for birthday parties and such. Halfway through the shift, if they decided it wasn't that busy and they might not need you for the second half, they'd ask you not to clock back on from your lunch break. Then you had to wait, off then clock, for up to an hour sometimes, for them to decide they for sure didn't need you and you could go home. If you left without the manager okaying it, you were written up. This was back in like 2003, and the only reason they got away with it is because all of the employees were kids and we were all friends with each other and with most of the regulars, and we all liked to skate, so most of us were there hanging out until the place closed even when we weren't on the clock. We didn't know that what they were doing was hella illegal. Story 11. Thankfully this is from a friend and not me, but a friend who did office work explained to me this unwritten rule that nobody left the office before their boss did, despite them having set working hours. Story 12. I worked at a center that cold called people on behalf of a 2-year technical school, so basically telemarketing. In a room no one was in but all of us making the calls. I hated it, but I was a broke kid and it paid $2 more per hour than anywhere else. Only women were hired to work there, and after I was hired, they told me there's a dress code and I had to wear a skirt. I ended up quitting soon after because I became convinced someone had cameras or mirrors for upskirt pictures. It just gave me creepy vibes. Story 13. Worked at a bakery where if we were there, doors had to be unlocked, even if the store was closed. Even if we had no food, we also weren't allowed to tell customers if the store was closed. Story 14. Not a work rule but a rule in a place I do work at. I was giving a talk about awareness of violent crimes and what services exist to help victims, aka the charity I work for. I was just getting set up in the hall when I realized I needed my anxiety meds and inhaler before I got started. One teacher who had brought her class to the hall early came up to me and demanded I put my inhaler away. I gave her a confused look and explained it's for my asthma, like no, I'm obviously not putting it away, it's medicine. Also will be not even 2 minutes, chill love. She then said the school has a strict no drugs policy. Luckily the head teacher had come back at that point and saw the confusion and said to the teacher it was fine. But yeah, that's how a teacher wanted me to not have my inhaler because it obviously wasn't medication and I'm obviously not an adult. Edit. Few folk are curious. I'm 23 at the time I was 21, so I definitely looked young enough to be student. Only issue is here in the UK school uniform is really common. Also when giving talks I wear my work ID lanyard around my neck. It's bright orange and has my charity's name on it, so you'd be pretty thick to get it confused with a school ID badge. Story 15. The way we were supposed to answer the phones. My last job was at a hotel, and while I won't give the entire script, it was supposed to say along the lines of "It's a beautiful day at hotel. When are you planning your wonderful vacation?" No, I didn't say that, plus more than half the time people already made reservations and likely had follow-up questions or was calling about something else. It was so stupid to say that. I refused. Story 16. Women had to wear foundation, lipstick, mascara, eyeliner, eyeshadow, blush, earrings, rings, bracelets, watch, hair flare, necklace and manicured nails. Men tucked in shirt, no neck beard, don't stink. Story 17. Worked at a soul-sucking call center where your bathroom breaks were deducted from your 15ths, And if you did get up and go to the restroom, this was a WFH gig, you get a Teams message after 30 seconds saying, "Are you okay? Why aren't you taking calls? We have calls holding, get back and ready." Story 18. My last job was as a cleaner. It was a bullshit job in a care home to supplement my real job there. The supervisor was a micromanaging old, up to and including, no stopping for coffee for 1 minute. It was so bizarre. In my new job someone was making drinks for everyone and asked if I wanted one. I was like, "Are we allowed?" And they looked at me like I was an alien. Story 19. When I was working at Ross's Loss Prevention, we weren't allowed to touch the shopping carts, ever, even though we are stationed near where they go, and plenty of idiots will just walk up to the front door, take there and leave the cart blocking the entrance. If I took the 5 seconds to walk over there and put it away, I get in trouble because I'm leaving my post. Instead I have to tell the head cashier to either go move them or have another associate move them, even if it's super busy. Ridiculous. Story 20. Tattoos had to be covered, but our shirts were short sleeve. I have a tattoo on my right shoulder that you could see maybe the bottom 10 millimeters of it with a shirt sleeve. I still had to wear a black armband to cover it. For 4 years I didn't. No one said a thing. No one commented on the tattoo ever. That last year wearing the armband, without fail at least once a week a customer would ask me about it. Story 21. Being obliged to always wear a suit, matching shoes and tie, even if you had to pick up some stuff from the office outside of normal working hours or on weekends. This rule was also enforced for customer visits. We had one customer which had a parking spot at 2 kilometers from their office, which required people to walk through some muddy field. Even then we were obliged to wear a suit and matching shoes and tie. Story 22. When I worked as a recruiter in the HR department of a major corporation, I spent hours a day approving and forwarding resumes of qualified candidates onto this one hiring manager, just to create a paper trail of her considering them. Meanwhile, she had the people she wanted to hire, all totally unqualified friends or referrals of friends or relatives, also apply. She then would call me on the phone and give me the names of the unqualified dolts to ensure I also forwarded them for her consideration. This was, fortunately, a 6-month consulting gig for me. I never encountered it that blatantly at any of the other Fortune 500 companies I consulted to, but I did have another gig where the staffing manager ordered me to violate multiple ethical and legal standards. I completely ignored those orders, and my contract was not renewed. Story 23. I once worked in the call center of a large company where we were treated like and got none of the perks the other departments did. We had to work holidays. We were subject to a point system where we got points for any lateness, even if it was 1 minute past your start time or absence, even though technically we had 5 sick days a year and could be fired at 5 points, etc., while the rest did not. The entire company except us was taken on all-day picnics and other events at least twice a year, etc. The icing on the cake though was the day the fire alarm went off in the 25-story building, and as everyone started for the fire exits, the department manager and head of HR yelled for everyone in the call center to return to their desks, as it was only a drill. Half of us left anyway, and likely would have been fired had the building manager not gotten furious and pointed out to the head of the company that it was illegal for us to remain in the building during a fire drill. Story 24. When you are walking and have a cup of coffee, it will be in your left hand. Your left arm will make a 90-degree angle while you are walking with your forearm parallel to the ground. You cannot drink the coffee while walking. Story 25. I once came in late to work, by literally 1 minute. My manager called me at 9 a.m. on the dot. As I was walking up the stairs to enter the office, I got a warning for not answering her call to inform her I was walking up the stairs. Story 26. I worked for a store manager who rounded by 3. I said, "No, you have to round by 5. 0 to 4 is rounded down. 5 to 9 is rounded up." No, she insisted. "It doesn't matter what number you round by as long as it's the same number every time." No, see, if you round by 3, then 0 to 2 gets rounded down, and 3 to 9 gets rounded up. That's nearly twice as likely to get bad rounding errors. Listen, I am a trained educator with 2 school-aged daughters. I know my math. You men think you know math so much better than women, yet every Monday when I called in the numbers, they didn't match what the district manager had. That manager was eventually demoted to a penalty store. When I told the DM the rounding by 3, they said, "That's technically fraud." She was later fired from that penalty store in an audit. Story 27. In my very first adult-type office job, I was responsible for ordering catering. The first time I ordered, I got sandwiches and salads. I got a green leafy salad and got chewed out by one of the VPs. She explained to me that eating greens in front of clients made us look weak, and I was only to order macaroni and potato salads, which I guess show strength. Story 28. I asked for a different calculator at work because the one I was using didn't have all the functions I needed, and the woman in charge of supplies denied me and told me the one I was using was fine. Then I left work and cried in my car and went to Walmart and bought a calculator. Story 29. I worked for the Anaheim Ducks at one of their ice rinks. I was allowed to wear a hat, but it had to be plain. I learned this rule when the manager told me to remove my Ducks hat. Again, I worked for the Ducks. Story 30. At a manual job I had standing up for 7 hours per day in a hot and sweaty factory floor during a 10-minute unpaid break. We were not allowed to sit down. We had to stand up right next to the seats provided for break use. The seats were only to be used for the later unpaid 20-minute lunch break. Meanwhile, the managers who created this rule sat down all day in an air-conditioned office drinking coffee. Just one example of management logic and motivation of the workforce. Not the way to get the best from your staff. Story 31. Somebody somewhere was offended by how they were told that the store was closing, so we were no longer allowed to announce that the store was closing or closed. This led to some really long waits where occasionally a manager would eventually have to go over and help them along and possibly politely tell them we had closed, and of course they'd be embarrassed because it was almost an hour past closing time, and then would still have to wait for the till to be counted afterwards. Ugh. Story 32. I used to work in a shop, and there we had to ask permission to use the bathroom, and even during breaks, when I think it should be normal to go to the toilet. Story 33. We weren't allowed to leave at the end of our shift unless our replacement was there. So if I was working first shift and the guy working second no Koledno showed, I had to stick around until they could find someone to replace me. Even worse is that the multiple times this happened, the one that didn't show up for work suffered no real consequences, unlike I would have if I left them understaffed for some reason. Story 34. Don't give receipts to homeless people. I worked for an upscale grocery store in an area with a lot of homeless people. There was a lot of ready-to-eat food options, including a salad sufat food bar, sandwich counter, and pizza by the slice, as well as a seating area. Obviously, for someone without a place to cook who likely would get turned away from restaurants, this was perfect. A lot of the local homeless population came in to get food, and the vast majority were decent people, were polite and kept things clean, even most of the ones with obvious serious mental illness. I even remember a most likely schizophrenic woman who would meticulously wipe every inch of the table and chair she used before and after. Anyway, they did a lot of stuff to try to deter homeless people, just because they didn't want them seen in the store. First they tried getting rid of reusable dishes and only having takeout boxes available to nudge people to leave the store with their food. Then they took out all the chairs at the tables and made people ask a cashier for a chair with their purchase, but not let homeless people. Obviously it didn't work. Cashiers were too busy to deal with that, and homeless people just stood at the tables or used a chair the cashiers didn't have time to collect and lock up again. Then they put code locks on the bathroom and put the code to enter on the bottom of the receipt. It changed daily. Staff weren't to give it out to anyone, and we were told we're not to provide receipts to the homeless when they purchase something and just give them a paid sticker, so they can't even take a. Needless to say, I didn't follow the rule at all. Got written up for it once when I gave a receipt to a guy who was wearing dusty clothes covered in paint, and the manager was right there. Funny thing was, the guy was clearly some kind of contractor tradesman who just got off work, not homeless. Anyway, I'd been tearing the cardboard takeout containers as the heavy ceramic salad bowls that we no longer had for most of the homeless customers for a while because the police, so I guess they were right to fire me in the end. They never caught on to the tear thing though. Story 35. Was working at an Office Depot briefly. I quit after less than a week. One morning, not a single customer was in the store. I asked the store manager if I could straighten up the front of the store till a customer came in. No, you have to stay behind the register so it looks like we're prepared in the event a customer comes in. Literally supposed to just stand there like a robot. I went to lean against the wall. Manager calls from the back room after seeing me on camera. No leaning, you have to just stand there, with no customers even in the store, just stand still on concrete, behind a register, indefinitely, all for a measly $8 back in 2007. I quit the next day. What a joke that job was. Story 36. If they ran short of people to work, and they managed to get you on the phone, you had no choice and had to come in if they asked. It was required, but if you didn't pick up the phone, they couldn't prove you got the voicemail and they would keep searching for someone. I was not on an on-call shift at the time. Story 37. I was working as a historian and we published government documents sorted by year. Commented, I was done with 1974 and wanted to start 1975. My lazy boss told me I could not start until she finished her part of 1974, so I didn't do anything but watch movies and write my thesis on paid time for 6 months. Story 38. I had a micromanaging GM who suddenly announced we could only have one nail per wall in our offices to hang up something. Some of us had been in our offices for years and they were highly personalized. It was crazy. Story 39. I used to work at a daycare. The kids were not allowed to scribble. If they were going to color, they had to be attempting to color inside the lines. I did not enforce that rule. I'm not going to stop a 3-year-old from scribbling. Story 40. I got written up for not tucking my shirt in. Same job, I had to cover my nose piercing with a band-aid. Guaranteed not one customer cared if I had my shirt tucked in. I was behind a counter, and more people commented on the band-aid than ever would have on the piercing. Story 41. At my company years ago, you could go out for dinner on business travel, full dinner, including wine and dessert at the best restaurant in the city, and charge it all off on your expense account, no problem. But if you just grabbed a 4-can of peanuts for dinner from the minibar at your hotel after work, expense denied. Story 42. I unfortunately worked at Burger King during COVID. I was the manager. In drive-thru we had to have customers put cash, coins, and credit cards into a random plastic container they gave us. When giving change back it had to go in the same plastic container. When handing food out it had to be in the container. Even a single drink had to be handed out awkwardly in a plastic container. The owner would sit at home watching security cameras and would near instantly call the store if someone didn't use the container. So their idea to prevent people getting sick was to make everyone reach into and touch the same plastic container. We were only required to clean it once every 6 hours. Hated that job. District manager treated us all like, you Judy. Story 43. For most of 2020 during COVID restrictions I had to clean all surfaces in the office 3 times daily, and keep a log of it which I had to email to the district manager. I was the only one working there. Who was I sanitizing it for? Story 44. No talking to each other unless it's work-related. We started calling out the boss and his son for talking about sports during work hours. That rule lasted until lunchtime. Mandatory shop meeting at 10 a.m. every morning. On day 3 we were all there in the office while boss was on the phone talking about BS to someone. Nobody was working for the whole time he was on the phone. Day 4 boss wasn't in, so we had the meeting just sitting around doing nothing for an hour. Day 5 mandatory meetings are cancelled. Story 45. Worked in an upmarket hotel. Hey Ray, some of the crazy rules I had to follow. 1. Always use a company pen to write anything down. 2. If you need water you must crouch under the bar so guests don't see you drinking. You can't be seen to be tired. 3. Social media must always be private so guests can't look you up. You must not be seen to have a life outside the hotel. It was unprofessional. 4. Ice cream must always be scooped in professional style. Quinnell's. None of us had restaurant experience. We were bartenders or it couldn't be served. 5. Glasses from the bar couldn't leave the bar unless they had liquid in or were dirty. 6. We weren't allowed to say no to a guest. To the point where someone spent a whole day building a flat-pack bunk bed set for a guest because her kids wanted that instead of separate. 7. If they heard a guest discussing you, you were under investigation, and if they heard a guest say anything negative, fired with immediate effect. They had to look pristine at all times. One afternoon I had to juggle 150 orders alone in 30°C heat and tights and I forgot one. I got fired for it. 8. If you did get fired, they asked you not to discuss it with anyone. They asked me not to tell anyone about the rumors management spread about us, about how I was treated, etc. However, I didn't sign anything and it was years ago. 9. This was a multi-million chain. They had cruise ships, they had hotels, etc., but they were checking us all to the penny. I got caught putting 10p change in the tip jar from a guest and was written up for not giving it back to the company. I got chased out on my way home because they found that I gave a replacement cola bottle to a guest. There's probably loads more, but those are things I can think of. Story 46. Women had to wear pantyhose under their pants. When they said that pantyhose were required, I assumed they meant if you were wearing a skirt or dress, so I showed up on my first day, dressed formally but of course no pantyhose since I was wearing pants. A coworker noticed and ratted me out to management, rather than telling me directly. The most ridiculous thing was that this was a bank teller job, where we are behind a counter that was intentionally designed so customers can't see you feet or legs since there are security alarms under the counter. I quit that job after a week. Story 47. Women were required to wear dresses and stockings. This was in the 1980s. Also, I got into trouble for not walking quickly enough past the boss office. Story 48. I know arriving to work early is kind of a standard, but my old job implemented a rule that you had to be there 15 minutes early. If you arrived any later than 15 minutes early, they sent you home. Story 49. Was told that being any later than 30 minutes early was considered late, and I would be fired if it happened more than once. My letter of resignation was on the boss's desk the next day. Not working a 16-hour job that steals my time and puts that kind of stress on employees. Story 50. No headphones. I was operating a reactor vessel which consisted of 2 very loud machines, and the monitoring station was right in between them. It was ear-splitting, so I bought a noise-canceling headset which cut the loud rumbling, but allowed me to hear my coworkers over the noise. Management objected. They didn't want people listening to music while on the job, so they had banned all types of earbuds, headphones, etc. I explained that I was just using the noise-canceling function, and demonstrated it to the manager. He agreed that it was very helpful against the noise, and saw that I wasn't listening to music or anything else. But he still went with the rules are rules approach, and the ban held. No headsets allowed. You'll never understand how a person can manage with his head so far up his. Story 51. We're not allowed to keep green scrub pads in the wash bucket. That's more of a health department rule than a store rule. We're not allowed to use the scissors to cut plastic bags. We have to use those little cutters that dull after 3 uses. One idiot left the walk-in cooler open all night, and now we're not allowed to use a bungee cord to keep the door propped open when we're carrying heavy things there. Story 52. Worked at a high school where the president and principal had a lot of disagreements about certain policies. If there was an official snow day, everyone, including students and staff, stayed home, except for those of us in the president's area. The worst part was it didn't change until they had an argument about something else, then we abruptly lost our snow days. Only about 8 of us sitting there looking foolish all day with nothing to do. Story 53. First I was told that I wasn't supposed to do overtime, then I was told that if someone gave me a project right before the end of my shift, a constant thing, I had to do it. Days later, I was sharply criticized for excessive overtime again. Story 54. I legitimately needed to sign off that I would always wear proper undergarments when I signed off on reading the employee handbook. Found out about a week later, some employees had been wearing dresses to work but would not wear anything underneath and had flashed customers on more than one occasion. So, there was that. Edit missing a word. Story 55. I worked a remote position managing other remote workers. Part of their jobs was time-specific, and part of their jobs was not. The previous manager didn't care when they did the other work as long as they did the time-sensitive stuff at the right time. We got a new manager who decided that because the contracts had working hours had been in there as a guideline in the past in them, that they were required to be at their desks for that specific time. I was required to message them on Teams at the starting time and then 5 minutes before the ending time and report back to her if they didn't respond. I declined to do that. I also started looking for a new job that would treat me like the skilled professional I am rather than a cog. Story 56. My boss thinks that if we just wait for the phone to ring we will get business, and doing marketing sales BD is a waste of time. Apparently calling him brain dead is frowned upon. Story 57. I had to cross a city street to get from one building to another building on our corporate campus. A trip I took 2 or 3 times a day. I was instructed I had to wait for the light to change and only go on the walk sign or face discipline. Up to and including dismissal. I felt like an idiot just standing there watching no traffic 99 of the time. But I did manage to be responsible for a corporate memo being written to all employees announcing this policy. At age 55, the guard came out of his little house one day to tell me I had to wait for the light. I told him I'd been crossing the street by myself for the past 50 years and he need to go back in his little house and leave me alone. 30 minutes the memo was posted on our intranet. When I told my boss the story, he laughed and told me the company wanted to pay me to stand and wait. He was a great boss. Story 58. Not going to be the most ridiculous thing on here, but I used to travel a lot of work and had one funky travel story. Basically, I was in Houston for a comic book convention and needed to get to San Antonio for work that Monday. So I called my boss on Friday as I was flying out to the convention and was like, hey, I'm going to be in Houston this weekend, so can I just rent a car, drive to San Antonio, and then drop it off to pick up my weekly rental? I can expense them separately. Those one-way rentals can get pretty expensive. Why don't you just fly? Well, if I fly it's going to take 4 times as long, sure, but we don't want to have to pay that one-way fee. So that Sunday I had to go to the airport an hour before my flight, fly to Dallas, wait around for my connection, then fly to San Antonio. Total travel time was about 7 hours from hotel door to hotel door. Story 59. We must write in blue pen. If we write in black pen on any work documents, it's an instant fire due to forgery reasons. Kinda dumb, I get it, but dumb. Story 60. I worked at the county fair one summer, selling kettle corn. If you had the closing shift, you weren't allowed to leave until the Ferris wheel lights turned off. Sometimes they wouldn't get turned off for over an hour after the fair was closed, and you didn't get paid for that extra time. On the plus side, I got to eat a fuckton of free kettle corn. Story 61. I once worked at Sephora after the first year of law school for summer. They had a rule where if I was asked to gift wrap a box, I had to wear a glove on my left hand and could only use that hand to wrap the present. I'm right-handed. I quit on day 3 and never worked another day of retail after that. Story 62. I had to remind my boss that they were the best person ever and are loved. Worse, I had to drive them home every day too. It was awful, like just because we are married they think they can get away with anything. Okay, I'll admit it, I do love my wife and she can get away with anything. Story 63. I was a clothing folder at Kmart in high school. There was one other folder and we'd do our thing quickly and talk while we did. Then we were no longer able to work within sight of each other, not within the same section within sight, so if she was halfway across the store but I could see her, we'd get in trouble. Story 64. I once had a retail job as an assistant manager. I was called to the office once because of my headband, which was floral and made of fabric. The other assistant manager claimed it was a headscarf and was offensive to her. The DM pulled out the dress code and could find nothing about headbands but went with the scarf part and said I couldn't wear it because it was made of fabric and wasn't a headband. It's been 25 years, and I'm still baffled. I wore a solid black fabric one after that, exactly the same as the floral one, and no one ever said again. I bought them in the same package. Story 65. My current salary job requires I work 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, but I'm only paid for 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. My boss also is trying to convert me to Mormonism just like he did to his other employees. If my work vehicle needs any maintenance, he wants me to take it to get fixed on a weekend, off the clock. Story 66. Old marketing company had a merger and was bought out by a hardcore born-again Christian. He insisted we, his new staff, all go through conversion to Christianity. We were all Catholics in a predominantly Catholic country. This conversion included monitored church attendance, office prayers, and 7-day liquid fasting. While working long hours we snuck out for burgers anyway. When he started demanding tithes from us we all quit and his company had to close down. Story 67. No sharing food unless you bring enough for the whole facility, of 200 people. Apparently, it had been common practice for managers and supervisors to buy their department's food on their own dime, but this one had tried to take pizza that wasn't for everyone, made a huge issue of it, and for some reason everyone got punished instead of just him. They even yelled at one guy because he brought a few dozen donuts for his own last day. The best part is that they claimed it was done by a vote in a culture committee meeting, which only HR and a couple top managers seem to be aware of. These are open meetings meant to look for ways to boost morale. Oh, the irony. So after management made that claim, they had about 50 pissed-off floor workers show up to the next meeting demanding a new vote. The policy was overturned. Story 68. I worked in a nightclub from 0207, around somewhere in 2005. Before every shift started, we were warned to look out for GHB. About 1 year later 2 girls were showing the same symptoms of being drugged. Lo and behold, the girls were extremely drunk and drank too much Sambuca, so management decided that Sambuca had to go. It was years later that I discovered that actually the staff was drinking too much of Sambuca, which is true, because I was part of it, but management decided to go for another story. Story 69. Guide a second lieutenant in the army world. While they technically still have the last say about how the mission should go, it's like having a boss, but you have to teach them everything so that the mission will go smoothly for you and your troops. Story 70. I'm a consultant, so I travel for work. like most companies, we have capped limits on the cost of hotels we stay at. On its own, it's a fair enough rule. I was on a 5-day trip, and one of the 5 nights at a particular hotel was 11 over the cap, but the total cost over the 5 nights averaged out to be less than the cap, e.g. The cap was 200, and one night was 211, but the other 4 were 170 or something, so the average was less than 200 night. This turned into a huge issue. My project manager had to get formal higher-up approval and fill out all this bullshit paperwork just to justify paying an extra 11. He straight up said to me, I can personally approve project budgets in the millions of dollars, but am not trusted to approve an 11 excess on a hotel stay without approval by 3 other people. Story 71. Completing and signing timesheets on a Thursday. When there is a holiday, it has to be done on a Wednesday, so many times I have to wait until the next week to edit my timesheet, because that can only be done at the end of a pay period. Story 72. I had to ask for OT at the beginning of every day, then got to play a game of 20 questions with management about why I needed the OT, when I didn't actually want the OT in the first place. The reason I needed the OT every day was always the same, because management never did its job of properly adjusting my workload to an amount I could finish in 8 hours as dictated by policy contract. I absolutely hated begging for and justifying OT that I didn't want to be working anyway. Just send me home after 8 hours if it's that much of a problem.